Howdy, you delicious people. I'm here today to review two movies. I'm here to review Savage Streets, and I'm here to review Rabid. Ultimately, the 1977 movie Rabid, because there had been a remake after that. So, at the end of the day, let's go out of our way to kind of bring up. I reviewed these movies at this point in time, but when looking at it, bringing these back to the forefront and kind of making them much more important, letting everybody know you can go right to the second of this recording and check both of these movies without a doubt on an app called Tubi, Tubi. It's a free movie TV service that you can, at the end of the day, say you saw any number of films along with these two here. Um, so ultimately, through issues of YouTube kind of having to talk about these, because ultimately I really liked them, I really enjoyed them, and so ultimately, when going into this, I'm like, hey, I wanted to kind of bring these back to the forefront and hope people enjoy them. So let's go into at first talking about Savage Streets. So, Savage Streets, I'm going to talk about each film in a very cryptic like sense, then break it down into a double five timed count after that amount of time, get into spoilers. And so ultimately, if you guys want to avoid all spoilers and come back to this and watch the spoiler variation and enjoy it along with me, then you could wait till I am done. You can fast forward to the moment of me switching screens to ultimately start talking about Rabid, and you guys can just be otherwise just amiss of all kinds of spoilers, and then come back and watch the spoiler variation. So, first, let's talk about Savage Streets. Ultimately, this movie is very savage. It's savage with the brutality that it delivers at some points and junctures. Reasonably, the best thing probably about this movie is its soundtrack. It really has a great soundtrack to follow up a very interesting movie. Going into this, we have Linda Blair, who ultimately a lot of people might remember from The Exorcist, ultimately playing the possessed child that ultimately kind of wreaks havoc on a mother's home. But now she is a very much fledgling, rebellious girl that ultimately is spending time in the principal's office, and ultimately, not only that, but also very much a lot of stuff is just kind of like getting even with a lot of people to where there seems to be an escalation of a a Scar gang that ultimately gets way too even, to the point to where ultimately Linda Blair has to dare say even up the score. Reasonably, this very much movie reminds me of the very much Crow film, to where ultimately the Ernie Hudson film, not any of the stuff that followed, like City of Angels and any numerous other films that carried after that they did have very much a good, decent soundtrack to them, but anything other than that, there wasn't much to them. So, going into Savage Streets and talking about it still cryptically, we very much go into this movie and very much have it to be a movie that might not be everyone's cup of tea. It does have one vicious moment that ultimately, if you probably go into any Google or anything like that and read some of the posters that describe this movie, maybe not every bit of this might be for you. Or ultimately, once you maybe read a description of this movie, again, it might not be your cup of tea. Ultimately, trying as much as possible to making this a much cleaner variation of this review, there might be some things I might have to forcibly leave out, even in spoiler variations, because trying to make a cleaner-ish review at some points. So ultimately, there gets a point in this movie where eventually Linda Blair has to eventually seek vengeance because it seems like the cops aren't going to do anything. So Linda Blair has to go on her own seeking a vengeance and settle scores and kind of very much do a very interesting aspect of killing going on. So I think reasonably there's not much to say beyond that, really breaking down this movie, and because it's just kind of a very interesting kind of one-upsmanship kind of movie that goes too far and then basically gets to the point of like kill or be killed at some point. uh, there are ultimately some sad moments that drive the character to ultimately go and seek justice. So that's really what the movie entails. And I think that's all I'm going to say about it in a very cryptic like sense, kind of quickly breaking into now spoilers about this movie. So, ultimately, if you want to go and watch this movie, ultimately you can on Tubi, Tubi. It's a free movie TV service to check out without a doubt if you want to go and do so. So, spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, immediately we have Linda Blair and her friends that are ultimately having a good time, just kind of eating ice cream, just just having a good old fun time out in the streets. Eventually, it gets to the aspect of we have this Scar gang who ultimately they they are shaking down a man for money, and ultimately, since they can't find said money, they are shaking down not only him but his woman with him, to the point of them grabbing and getting some feels of them trying to figure out, uh, since they don't have their money from this man, ultimately they're going to try and justify, hey, what could we do with this woman to ultimately kind of get it to where it's like, well, good enough to. Seems a lot of just grabbing women and kind of like just giving it a good old feel, if you know what I mean. So within this movie, we have a shakedown of a guy that's like, hey, where's my money? Ultimately, this guy wants money and blow and stuff like that. And so ultimately, he doesn't get that from that person. I guess it is what it is. So eventually, they just go on a driving cruise to otherwise drive through the town, just have fun. And they almost run over somebody. They had their horn blowing. The only problem is they had their horn blowing to the wrong person. Linda Blair's sister. Linda Blair's character's sister ultimately is deaf. She can't hear. And ultimately, they were one of Linda Blair's friends was going to drink alcohol, and Linda Blair is like, "Yeah, not in front of my sister. Like, come on." Um, anyways, so because concerning her sister is very innocent, so leading us dare say past the point of okay, the gang members are have gone. Oh, okay, we've had our fun. We're gonna apologize. I'm sorry. This and that. Eventually, the girls get back at the boys for stealing, while stealing their car and having a good old drive away from it. And so, the boys ending up chasing after their car. And then once they find the car is has a ton of trash all over it, and so they have to try to clean this up. So this leads us to going into the school, where we find out that Linda Blair, dare say, is a student on the edge. It seems like she's consistently speaking to her principal. It seems like she's best buddies, best pals with the principal, and basically, like, this is a principal that doesn't take crap from anybody, even from her, even from Linda Blair's character. Really showcasing us that you don't F with Linda Blair, but dare say this principal doesn't give an F either. So basically, this principal is like convincing Linda Blair that it's like, dude, you are right on the edge. Uh, and ultimately, there's kind of this like back and forth going on, and like that they're both two people that don't want to put up with crap from nobody. And so eventually, after she leaves this whole conversation, she basically tells her friends, it's like, hey, yeah, the principal's hitting on me and this and that. So leading us to eventually we're gonna kind of, if anything, it's not gonna be whole hugely. There's probably gonna be a lot of stuff that's like um kind of just murky waters and stuff like that. So it seems like we consistently have Linda Blair at some points fighting with this girl. It seems like she's always arguing with this girl, fighting with this girl, stuff like that, to the point where like they're at points and odds of ripping off clothes, and that's why Linda Blair would go to the principal's office, and it just seems like there is a consistent like fighting with this one girl that ultimately is some like head cheerleader or whatever. So eventually we have Linda Blair, who's ultimately with all of her friends within the locker room like shower, getting, I guess, transitioning um from the gym or something. Yeah, from the gym, doing aerobics and stuff like that. So eventually we have it to where while Linda Blair is changing and ultimately having a fight again with one of with the girl that is consistently fighting over some man. It seems like Linda Blair is also fighting over same said man and this and that. So, anyways, they eventually fight out into this shower. A shower fight breaks out, and like, so these two girls, fully clothed, fighting it out with all these girls that probably have a bar of soap to between their entire bodies. Like basically an entire shower room of a lot of not so quite clothed women, let's just say. So, anyways, trying to make this review as clean as possible. So we we have it to where Linda Blair fighting said woman. All the while, eventually, we find out that uh, it seems that her sister is in this auditorium, or this gym, and ultimately talking to one of the Scar members, one of the gang members, and like it seems like this girl is very innocent, and we have this one gang member that wants to kind of get her not so quite that innocent, to the point where he kisses her and she doesn't like that. But then eventually she is thrown into the arms of the other Scar members that eventually, let's just say, take advantage of her. And then eventually leave her to being put into the hospital. To where eventually someone ends up finding her, and eventually they put her in the hospital, and ultimately we lead to, after seeing and hearing all of this, we eventually have it to where Linda Blair is seen in a club, kind of drinking her woes, realizing that the police aren't going to do crap, and she is kind of being consulted by this seemingly older woman, and eventually we get to the aspect of these crow guys that are otherwise within this bar as well, and or these scar guys. I think I said crow guys. These scar guys are also in this club as well. So we get to the aspect of that they are kind of celebrating their weird victory. I guess their weird victory of getting their youngest member to grow a pair, and so ultimately they are grabbing right around that area, just like, yeah, you became a man. We're gonna celebrate, and immediately this guy is just like, no, like, I don't want to celebrate this. It's not like the youngest of them are just like, I don't want to celebrate this. Like it wasn't like really that, wasn't really, because ultimately he was forced into doing this, and he didn't like it. So reasonably, we get to the aspect of these guys are just grabbing women and just playing around with them, and eventually they grab one of Linda Blair's friends, and immediately you have two guys out of nowhere just saying, "Hey, like, how about you how about you stop fooling around?" And so immediately we have, ultimately, when one of the Scars guys ultimately accidentally hit or almost hit Linda Blair's sister. Immediately the leader told the driver to tell them to that he's sorry. So in this situation, when the two guys ultimately come and say, "Hey, like, how about you stop messing around with all the women?" Like, immediately the leader talks to the guy who was the driver before, to ultimately say, "Hey, like, you should really apologize to these guys." He's like, "God, you always are make me look bad and this and that." And so the guy goes, "Okay, well, of course, this time around I will definitely apologize." So he apologizes with his fists. And so they basically start throwing these guys around, and eventually the girl gets a knife, and one of Linda Blair's friends that ultimately has her jacket. And eventually we find out that this girl is having a baby, and she's eventually going to get married and this and that. She takes out a knife and slices the leader of this gang, and eventually they like break up this fight, and eventually everything, which we think is being resolved. So we go to another day of school, la di da. We're ultimately we have the gang members all coming together, and the gang leader tells the little small minion-ish like guy to otherwise find the girl that had given him the scar the night before. So eventually we find said girl, and she had just gotten her wedding dress and stuff like that, and she's all happy and this and that. So we eventually have this girl kind of like walking around through this bridge, and immediately the smallest or the youngest of the gang is ultimately telling the leader, it's like, you're only going to scare her, right? It's like, you're not going to do anything beyond that, right? Like, all you're going to do is scare her. And the leader is ultimately telling him, like, hey man, just chill out, like I got this. So basically they corner the girl on this bridge, and basically they grab her, and then the leader, like, basic all pretty much all he does is really just gets angry at her, grabs her, and then throws her over the bridge and kills her. And I'm like, oh my god. So I'm like, what the F at this point? Uh, and so now Linda Blair and all of her friends have heard the news of her friend being killed. And eventually we get it to where the youngest of this gang, this Scars gang, eventually he goes to the girl that he had hurt, and he holds her hand. He hopes that he can kind of wake her up, and because he wants to confess to her and tell her, it's like, hey, I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to, uh, I didn't mean, like, they basically forced me, and I didn't want anything to do with it. All the while, eventually, Linda Blair is just kind of eventually going and seeing her sister, and kind of walks into the room as this guy's basically confessing of what he did to this girl in a coma. She overhears this and grabs him and does this weird slapping like thing, and to where she like weirdly slaps him, and he's like taking all of this, and he's like, I'm sorry, and then he basically like runs away, and she tries to chase after him, but then she just stops, and she's like, I'm gonna find him, I'm gonna get him. And so immediately we have, like, as normal scenario, when Bruce Wayne turns into Batman and this and that, we have Linda Blair eventually turning into like a Batman-ish like vigilante character. And so eventually she has to put on her very black-ish like suit, because ultimately she had gotten expelled from school, and it's not like she has anything else left to do. So eventually she goes and hunts down this guy to get information from him. And so ultimately she hunts him down, puts a knife to his throat, and like this guy is squealing like a pig. Like basically confesses to what Linda Blair is having knifed to said youngest gang member's throat, and he's squealing like a pig, telling her that he had that what he had done to her sister, and then after that what he and his friends had done to her friend. And so immediately she's like, oh, okay, all right, great that you've confessed this. So we have it to now. There are two goons. Two goons that, of course, are going to get their comeuppance. We consistently have Linda Blair right there talking to the two goons, basically mentioning to them, it's like, oh yeah, you guys must be really hard up, and you can't find a good woman to please you, right? Huh? And so immediately these guys take chase, and they're coming up with all these scenarios of all the things that they're going to do to this woman, and all the while like consistently repetitiously walking through this factory, or this facility. And basically we consistently have Linda Blair like talking in the background, eventually just kind of making just small talk for these guys to try to figure out where she supposedly is. So eventually we find out that this recording, or that this actual Linda Blair talking, is actually just some recording. And eventually we find out that one of the guys eventually does find Linda Blair, but they are met with a arrow to basically kill said person. And basically we have another goon with an axe that is ultimately just like, yeah, I bet, like, he's already assumed that the guy has found Linda Blair and that he's doing things to her, and that they're gonna have such a fun time and this and that. Well, it ends up that this guy finds Linda Blair already killing another person, and so this goon, like a stupid goon, drops the axe and runs away. Well, this guy runs away into getting an arrow into him. So now we have third goon, that ultimately big brutish goon that was ultimately having the scar on his face from time before. So reasonably you have to make an example of this character. And so immediately this guy is coming into the facility and realizing that, oh my god, my friends are dead. What's going on? And immediately this guy is met with arrows to the leg. So this guy drops, and so this guy is scrambling to get bullets into his gun, and randomly fires off into the air somewhere, trying to hope that he had gotten Linda Blair. And immediately he asks if he had got her, and Linda Blair finally appears, and she's like, "No, you didn't get me." Like, and she does this, like, I love this, like, this really, like, I love how, like, confident Linda Blair is throughout these whole entire scenes of, like, God, I love this. This is the best part of the movie, is when she is, like, overly confident and gonna take all these characters out. So, yeah, what she does is she realizes that she's like, that she ultimately, like, she shoots an arrow at this guy, but sadly it misses. So ultimately she's like, well, like, you know what? I'm out of arrows. Look me, I'm out of arrows. So I'm going to go into my car and get my other set of arrows. I'll be right back. So this guy is limping around, and limping around to get to her and get to where she has her car, maybe thinking that he can maybe sneak up on her. Well, she latches the fence and tries to go and get to her car to get these arrows. Or then just kind of wait for this guy to continue to drag his way all the way to her. So we have this stupid guy that ultimately goes right, eventually picks himself up, gets right to the fence, and we, like, Wile E. Coyote moment going on here. There was a rope attached to the end, or was attached to the bottom of this fence, and Linda Blair drives off. Guy gets hung upside down onto the fence, and then we break into Linda Blair uh, talking that she is going to, or that this guy looks like a pig getting ready for the slaughterhouse, and then she starts mentioning uh mentioning her friends, and how basically now she's gonna even the score of how that they were um left that way, and now this guy's gonna have the same fate. She's gonna get her knife out to eventually start carving him up, and so this guy takes the fence door and smacks Linda Blair to where ultimately she falls over, and then afterwards he slowly but surely unropes himself and gets on top of Linda Blair. Um, and she stabs him with a knife, ultimately leading her to eventually get away to try and go into this facility. We eventually have Goon following her. Eventually, Linda Blair is kind of out of options. She doesn't have much weaponry to use. So ultimately, she just starts pouring paint onto this guy because that's pretty much all she has. Starts pouring paint on this guy and eventually flips a lighter and lights this guy on fire. So this guy lights on fire and smashes through the window and just burns up in front of this store and ultimately just dies. So pretty much justice is served, and pretty much at the very end of this movie, it's just Linda Blair and her friends all at the funeral of her friend, and that's just how the movie just ends. So that is all that I have to say about Savage Streets. Pretty good movie when looking at the real action of it. Just very, I really love overly confident heroes, or in some case, this could be an anti-hero at some point. But anyways, I think let's move on to Rabid. So, Rabid, a 1977 remake. I say that because ultimately, I reviewed the more current Rabid, well, current to the second this recording, because who freaking knows if they're gonna make any other remakes or reboots or whatever sequels. So, going into this movie, very bizarre approach, and I'm talking about this in a cryptic sense. Very bizarre approach to a zombie movie, because we kind of see this slow trickle of infection, and then the slow trickle of eventually uh, everything gone rampant. Really, speaking of rampant, basically this is a case of severe rabies, which is kind of interesting. Which ultimately kind of gets us the interesting build. So we eventually have a girl that is infecting people from not the conventional sense of just biting them. No, she basically transforms people by most of the time hugging them, because ultimately she has a infectional thing coming from her armpit, and we'll discuss that once we actually get into spoilers. It's weird, bizarre, I know, but if anything, eventually we get into just some weird and or bizarre-ish like story. So at the end of the day, it's a very interesting story, because eventually just kind of like at some point it's kind of like how Savage Streets was. It kind of gets to the point of like sad moments, but then eventually it has a like a big ending, a big build ending, where like in this movie, like it really starts out slow, but then eventually it really starts to pick up, and then you're just like, oh my god, nothing is safe. Like basically when you start looking at everybody in like in within this movie, you're like, oh my god, when is the next time that somebody's gonna start being infected and start killing, and it's gonna be in the worst scenario, and that's where everything goes. It's just like the worst possible scenarios of just like, okay, I think that guy's, or I think that person's infected. Oh my god, and this is here, this is in this here. No, this is gonna suck. Um, yeah. Very interesting subway scene. Very interesting. Just overall kind of approach, because you have this to be eventually just kind of so widespread, that eventually, like towards the end of the movie, when you're basically seeing our character that I believe his last name is Reed, eventually goes into like basically wiping a zombie off the windshield of his car, because like military is uh, coming in the full front and trying to uh, contain this thing and try to um, like shoot it all down, shoot it all up and down, get rid of it, and it gets to the point where it even affects the police department at some points. So yeah, like it gets so widespread and it gets pretty dang cool, I think, honestly. So let's pretty much just kind of get into spoiler variation, because reasonably, yeah, it's an interesting story. We have Rose, who ultimately is the main focus of this movie, and then we have a kind of stuntman, kind of boyfriend that eventually um, is the guy that is ultimately seeing the carnage of all this, and he is just trying to hope that he can like live after all of this, because yeah, everything is going crazy, to the point where they're trying to uh, think of like vaccinations and stuff like that, because they're assuming they can figure out what the cure is, but really when looking at it, there is no cure for if someone were to get bitten by anybody. But anyways, some very interesting scenes and scenarios that bleed to the very end of this movie. So at the end of the day, let's go into spoilers. I know probably these cryptic versions are very quick and very easy, but at the end of the day, I think want to just review all this stuff and get it done fairly quickly. So let's get into spoilers about this movie. I really both of these movies are, at the end of the day, they're kind of very weird and very odd, but god dang it, they're fun movies. So at the end of the day, spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time we can do spoil this movie. So we ultimately have Rose, the model, and Reed, the stuntman, who ultimately go on a little motorcycle drive, and they otherwise end up into a car accident. Well, he's driving a motorcycle, but car accident, which leads them into a nearby plastic surgery hospital that can save this woman's life with some quick surgery. The only problem is they are doing skin grafts, and with the skin grafts, they are not using normal human cadaverish like skin. they are using the skin of animals, I think like a cow or something. So basically, they do this quick, like, surgery as if it's like the greatest thing ever. Like, yeah, this is like a one of a kind like surgery that we're proceeding. Like, whew, yeah. So basically, we have a business associate of the doctor of this hospital that eventually just drives drives Reed home because this girl is honestly currently in a medical coma right now, and eventually she'll wake up. Eventually, once she wakes, uh, they're gonna call Reed and let her know that everything's fine and to come and get her. So this guy is taking some business associate and they're driving home, and he's just kind of working on um, some like medical or Reed is working on some like engine pieces at home. He's just kind of just biding his time. All while eventually Rose is biding her time to eventually bizarrely wake up. Uh, she is waking up and screaming bizarrely to the heavens because she is feeling fairly sick when she wakes up. Wonder why. So she is waking up to, I believe, one of the orderlies, and eventually that said orderly goes and says, "Hey, like you're fine, like everything's good. If anything, let me get the doctor so he can look at you and kind of double check on you and whatever." And so the girl is just like, "You know what? I am kind of just really fine. If anything, I'm just really cold. If anything, you're really warm. If anything, could you just like, could you just embrace me? Could you just hug me and like after that, like we'll get the doctor and whatever." And so we we have to where this guy is just like, "Well, yeah, you are attractive, and you know what? How about I do give you a little hug?" And so he hugs her, and basically he's just like, "Oh, okay, I think we've done this long enough. Like, I think I'm gonna go and get the doctor." And she will not let go. And so eventually he is like, oh, he's realizing that he's like, "Oh my god, like I must have gotten like cut somehow. It feels like I have a stab wound somewhere." Um and so immediately we find out again this girl is, let's just say, hugging people to be undead. So we have this orderly that eventually like doesn't realize how he had gotten hurt, and eventually he gets uh, like inspected by this doctor, and the doctor is seeing this like this bizarrish wound that this orderly has, and he's like, "You know what, like this blood is like weirdly like weirdly like not clotting or something like that. It's some kind of weird thing going on here." And so eventually we have Rose that seems to be making herself cozy with a lot of the other people in this hospital. Eventually there's this one girl that is in this like jacuzzi or something, and Rose makes her way to this woman is like, "Hey, how about we spend some time together?" Like, can I share the can I share this yakuza with you? And she's like, you know what, I'm not sure about that. So eventually, Rose eventually infects uh, this this patient, of course. Eventually, she goes into this barn section where they have all these like cows and whatever, and there's this hillbilly ash looking guy, this old elderly hillbilly ash looking guy that approaches um, this girl, and eventually like he gets attacked as well, he gets infected as well, I mean. So we eventually get to where old elderly man eventually goes to some restaurant and attacks a ton of people. We eventually get to the aspect of the doctor eventually approaching the approaching Rose, and ultimately ending up wanting to talk to her because he's like, you know what, I need to like talk to this patient. It seems like something's going on around her, and I think like she's like the magnet or something of all this. And eventually, him talking to her eventually gets him to eventually be at some point infected as well. To where eventually he's in mid surgery, and eventually he is stalling repetitiously, uh, sewing somebody up. All the while, we eventually have Rose calling Reed in the middle of the night and telling him he desperately needs to be there, and like it's an emergency and this and that. So Reed is calling on this business associate that he had gotten this ride from, and he's like, hey, like, is there any way then that like you can like drive me up there? Because it feels like it's life or death. It seems like she desperately needs me, and like she called me in the middle of the night and called me all spooked and this and that. So, because this doctor is all of a sudden like while he's sewing people up and everything like that, his eye has a little bit of goop, and so immediately he is asking for some scissors. Uh, and so this nurse gives him some scissors, and he cuts her finger and then starts eating her finger. And so everybody is going freaking wild into this hospital. And so immediately Rose is running out of the hospital. Running out of the hospital, and eventually finding some truck driver, some semi truck driver, for her to eventually infect him. So eventually we have it to where Reed is making back to this plastic surgeon's facility to ultimately find out that his girlfriend is not there, and that his girlfriend is already on her way to get to him. And so ultimately they're kind of on like, we have Reed that ultimately can't really go anywhere because everything is on lockdown for like 48 hours or something like that. There's some kind of like lockdown going on, like they're trying to prevent whatever this like severe rabies thing is. And so immediately they're like quarantining this area, and trying to ultimately come up to the conclusion of trying to figure this out. because evidently the doctor is severely infected. They have him in the back of some wagon somewhere, and he's going crazy because he's a freaking zombie at this point. Evidently, we find out some of the police officers had been bitten or whatever, but they're taking the vaccines. So we eventually have it to where like Reed doesn't exactly know uh, like what's going on with Rose, and so one of the guys said, "Hey, how about like if anything, we have a couple of like one of the police officers mentions to Rita. It's like, well, hey, we have a bunch of women that maybe you can ID down at the station. If you want to come with me, like we'd be happy to do that." So eventually, Reed goes down to the police station. Eventually, calls one of Rose's friends, and ultimately, like tells her, it's like, hey, yeah, like like it seems like Rose is like off somewhere, and ultimately we find out that her friend is gonna like keep her comfy while um like ultimately like Rose had called her friend and told her that she was coming to her to ultimately just kind of wait this whole thing out. So ultimately, since Reed had gotten that call, basically he is um, just kind of like waiting at the jail cell, just kind of take like a night off and whatever, and just kind of read about this whole like rabies thing and see what it's all about. So eventually, um, the two guys are otherwise just kind of like waiting this whole thing out. They're really tired, and eventually one of the police officers they find infected, and so eventually they're like shooting at him and it won't do any good. It's like shoot for the head. And so eventually they kill this guy. And so basically they're just like, oh my god, these things are like unstoppable and this and that. So we eventually have to where after this police station, it seems that uh, everybody's getting vaccinated for rabies, but again, bites don't really like. If you get bitten, then that's the big thing. So try to avoid to get bitten. So it basically has like, okay, we've kind of quarantined this place off, like, so ultimately, how about like you guys just kind of get on your way? So the guys eventually go onto the road and they start driving. They're drinking as much coffee as they can, and they're trying to make it back home. Ultimately, Reed to try to figure out where Rose is, and all the while, eventually, Rose has infected a number of guys along the way, either people she's met around this apartment complex that her friend has been into, because every single time that Rose doesn't infect someone, she starts getting really, really sick. Really, really sick, and just like in a fetal position in her in the bathroom. It's kind of like, I'm really, really sick. So she goes out to infect random people, whether it's in some, let's just say, scandalous uh, movie theater that shows, let's just say, certain kinds of films. Because again, this has to be a cleaner variation of this review. So ultimately, this girl starts to infect random guys eventually by touching them, hugging them, and so on and so forth. So eventually we get it to where eventually we have it to it being to where Rose's friend is eventually getting on some subway. And eventually I'm like, oh my god. Like, here's where we start to get to these crazy moments where anybody at any point in time is going to be infected. Like, we basically have Reed, uh, who is dropping the business associate off at his home, and he is borrowing this guy's car to ultimately make it back to try to find Rose. So we ultimately have Rose's friend that is ultimately in the subway, and all of a sudden one of the people start to look sick, and then like basically we have this crazy chain of events where everybody is starting to just eat away at people in the subway. It's freaking nuts. And very vicious, very just like feeding frenzy, like people are getting infected and eating everybody. It's crazy. So, but basically it gets to the aspect of Rose's friend eventually makes it out alive at all this and eventually makes it home to Rose. To where Reed this entire time is seeing the military full force try to take down basically HELL breaking loose on this city. Like basically we are seeing like a zombie just jump on the windshield of Reed's car, and we have the military force that is like killing this thing and shooting it down, and then trying to wipe all the zombie bits off of this guy's windshield, and ultimately telling him it's like, okay, buddy, you can continue through. And basically how like everything has just broken down, and like pretty much everything is going horribly awry, to the point to where at some point like there is a mall that ultimately has like a Santa that is like having all kids and freaking people um, kind of, hey, what do you want there, Jimmy, for your birthday or whatever, or for Christmas? And so eventually within this mall, we eventually have a zombie coming into this mall and infecting people to where eventually we have to take this zombie down, and then eventually I think uh, at some point like I think that like Santa becomes infected or something. So which I think is kind of like to see a mall where all of a sudden like somebody gets infected in this mall. It's kind of crazy. But anyways, so eventually we get into where Reed is ultimately trying to make his way to Rose, and eventually once he does, he he eventually makes his way to Rose to chagrin of Rose is again hugging her way onto yet another victim. The only problem is that victim is her friend. And so eventually, Reed walks in on her friend uh, down on the ground, and he's like, "Oh my god, I figured it out. You're the person that is like creating this entire plague. Like, I can't believe it." And so Rose is trying to leave, trying to get to see me the next person. Rose and Reed is trying to stop her. He's trying to prevent her. He's like, "Hold on, like, don't do this." And he's like falling down a flight of stairs trying to stop her, and like basically like no one will stop her. So what she ends up doing is and here's where I'm gonna I'm gonna stop at one point and come back to something. So we ultimately have, because I need a transition to get this out, and then I'll get right back into what is next to come. So because this is a really interesting moment. So we have the other character that I had to desperately go with Reed to ultimately go back in the middle of the night to get Rose, the business associate of the doctor. And so eventually just kind of says like au revoir to Reed, and eventually just kind of goes home and kind of looks around, kind of sees what's for dinner, and he's kind of like looking around at his house, and he's like, "Why is this house so quiet?" And so immediately he's kind of like asking for his wife. It's like, "Wife, where are you at, wife?" Like, seems kind of weird. This house isn't that quiet. I should be hearing a baby scream or something like that, or something should be going on. So we have it uh, to where our business associate as like man is walking through his house. Immediately, eventually, he goes into his baby's room to just be like, "Hey, where's my baby?" And basically, he finds a trail of blood on the ground, or on the ground, or on the floor. And he is like, "Oh my god, something happened. What happened?" And basically he uh like opens the lid of this thing, and there's like blood all over this thing, and he's like, "Oh my god." And eventually we keep hearing these sounds. And so eventually, we open this like closet esh like thing, and spring open comes his wife, uh, all zombified and all, to eventually say hello, hello, my lovely man to be. So eventually, we pretty much can call it that this guy's pretty much freaking toast, as well as like there's so many scenes, just random scenes where like the freaking construction workers that all of a sudden like drill through some car and then open up some car and grab the driver guy of some car, and then immediately uh, a guy jumps to the front seat of the car to drive away crazily, while these construction worker guys are eating the driver of said car, and the other guys are just crazily driving away, trying to avoid this whole scenario. So we eventually see that like there's flamethrowers and all this kinds of craziness, all to uh, try to take over this and cure this infection. So basically, we have it to where now we are back to Rose. Rose had decided to uh, do the best thing, and she had decided to infect someone. And immediately, once she does that, she calls Reed and tells him what she's doing, and he's just like, no, like, don't do this, like, don't. So immediately she's like, yes. And then I like, I'll be sure if he like doesn't become infected, then I'm fine. So Reed just kind of breaks down, freaking gets all upset, and really just gets to the point where eventually he just like breaks his phone because he's so mad um, that she had been the one to cause all of this. And basically, it just leads to the next scene where you basically just see uh, Rose basically on the side of the road, just dead, like roadkill. And we have these two guys coming in, collecting the body, and throwing her in some um, like trash compactor like thing, and just calling it a day. That's basically just how the movie ends. So yeah, kind of an interesting movie at the end of it all, but it's an armpit away, I guess you could say, of being a weird and or wild like movie. I'm sure there's probably something that I probably forgot, or there's probably some things where I kind of mixed around, or kind of like, I'm sure there might be of other things that ultimately might have been a little bit more exciting at some point that I forgot to mention, or this and that. But anyways, I think that's about it for this one. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.